on thing. Well, thank you very much, Barney. Thanks everybody for giving up your Tuesday night. Beautiful environment to be here, beautiful building. What I thought I would do is talk a bit about the more interesting half of the book, which looks at the Israel-Hezbollah conflict basically throughout in its entirety. It's sort of a forgotten conflict in a sense. It's sort of splashed onto our television screens in 2006 in this big 34-day war between Israel and the Lebanese Shiite militant group Hezbollah, and the lessons that emerged from 2006 were really quite, well, they're very important, but the lessons were also very short-sighted. People sort of didn't look at the 2 decades of conflict that existed before between Israel and Hezbollah. In a sense, it represents, pardon the analogy, what the Vietnam War is to the U.S., the Lebanon War is to the Israelis, in that they fought an 18-year messy guerrilla conflict before eventually pulling out of Lebanon in 2000. They went in 82, pulled out in 2000, before 2006 sort of splashed onto our television screens. But before I get into all that, I think it's really an important conflict that is chock full of lessons for the United States, for the UK. In some cases, what not to do. In other cases, things that we can learn from the Israeli experience fighting Hezbollah. It also sort of highlights some important things regarding processes of military change, so how armies and also insurgent groups, Hezbollah, learn and adapt against each other, vis-a-vis one another, as well as some of the trials and tribulations of innovation in a military and what works and what doesn't work, the role of technology and its limitations, and also sort of a great case study for the evolution of insurgency. Hezbollah in the early 80s, this sort of ragtag militia that emerges from the Lebanese civil war, this sort of chaos of everybody fighting each other, to what we saw in 2006, this really sophisticated militant group that had expensive technology, sophisticated technology, long-range rockets, and the works. So sort of a great case study for how they got from point A to point B. And of course, lots of strategic parables that I think I'll try and highlight as I go along. So what I'll do is I'll sort of highlight important milestones in the conflict that will take you through the long evolution of the conflict. But before I do that, so where are we now? Right now, Hezbollah, the Lebanese group, is fighting in Syria alongside the Syrian army of Bashar Assad, alongside the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, fighting ISIS, Sunni rebel groups, while the Israeli military is carrying out airstrikes against Hezbollah, Syrian or Iranian targets inside Syria in order to prevent sort of game-changing weaponry from making its way to Hezbollah. And of course, you have Hezbollah alongside the Russians, Hezbollah with long-range weaponry, with armored personnel carriers in some cases. Sort of how did we get to this point? And you really can't understand what's going on now unless you take a good look back at where we came from. But what was so interesting about 2006 was this narrative of this sophisticated militant group that basically fought the technologically savvy, conventionally superior Israeli army to more or less a standstill, or at least a mediocre result from the Israeli perspective. So to understand why that happened, I mean, I'll sort of try and highlight why that happened. And I think everybody took a good look at 2006. I know at Shrivenham, the DC, maybe even Barney himself came up with sort of important lessons to draw, as did the Department of Defense in the U.S., the Army, the capstone concept. Everyone looked and said, what happened here? And in the U.S. and the U.K., they sort of labeled Hezbollah as sort of paradigmatic of what the future adversary is going to look like for the Western military, so the democratic, post-heroic military. This is the sort of future adversary. Amongst the people, to use General Rupert Smith's quote, with tech savvy, embedded in the civilian population, playing on a different set of rules, asymmetric, hybrid, if you like the term, very big in the United States. This blending of tactics and strategies. So let's sort of take you through that. Yesterday, I focused a little bit more on the talks are similar. Focused a bit more on the assassination of Soleimani and the implications for Hezbollah, for Israel, for Syria, etc. I'm happy to touch on that in the Q&A, but this will sort of take you through the conflict with the focus more on the innovation and adaptation side of things. So sort of long before coins became so important in light of Iraq and Afghanistan. The Israelis were sort of dealing in one way or another the counter-guerrilla conflict vis-a-vis Hezbollah since 82. And it sort of all starts, we'll start our story in 1982. I'm not going to take you back to the very beginning. I think we'd be here forever. Lebanon is convulsed in civil war. We have Sunnis and Shiites and Christians and Catholics and Maronites, everybody fighting each other, which I think will sound familiar. The Palestinian militias and the PLO were formerly in Jordan, but had moved and set up shop in Lebanon as sort of their base to sort of target Israel in these militia attacks and infiltration attacks from Lebanon into Israel, so crossing into northern Israel. Some particularly notably gruesome attacks throughout the 70s and early 80s. And this essentially leads Israel to decide that we need to go into Lebanon to deal with the Palestinians and stop these attacks. So you want to talk about mission creep. This is sort of the ultimate sign of mission creep. Amidst all these different groups fighting each other, the Lebanese Civil War, which started in 75, the Shiites, as one of the three main denominations, but actually one of 18, decide to arm themselves as well. And this has to do also with the sort of awakening that had taken place in the Middle East. 1979, the Iranian Revolution sort of really acted as an earthquake, as an awakening for Shiites in the Middle East. And these were sort of, this undercurrent was sort of not really grasped to the extent it should have before Israel decides to go rumbling in to South Lebanon, which is sort of the Shiite majority live there in the Bekaa Valley in the north. They go into Lebanon in 82. The catalyst is actually the failed assassination of the Israeli ambassador outside the Dorchester Hotel in London by a Palestinian militia group, and this is sort of broke the camel's back, and they go into Lebanon with the ultimate goal of sort of setting up or empowering a Maronite leader by the name of Bashir Gemayel. It's a long story, to sort of become the leader of Lebanon, who will then be friendly towards Israel and sort of take Lebanon out of the equation, as in you'll have a friendly government set up in the north, the northern border, that will sort of make peace. This all falls apart when Bashir Gemayel is assassinated after a few months, and chaos kicks off. As part of, and the Shiites, it's important to know, were not initially against Israel at all. They sort of welcomed them because the Palestinians had set up shop in the Shiite areas of support, sort of a little known fact. And when you go back and dig at the statements from the Shiite militia that sort of emerged, was Amal, which was in a way predecessor to Hezbollah. They sort of welcomed the Israelis with rose petals and rice in some cases. And I actually got to interview the Israeli defense minister at the time in the 80s. He's actually since passed away. And just to sort of illustrate the total misconception of the operating environment, the theater that you're into, Israel goes to the Shiite militia, who was not fighting it at the time, the Amal militia, and says, all we want is for the Palestinian militias to stop crossing into Israel, to stop doing attacks. We'll arm you, we'll help you set up shop in the south, just keep them away from the border. And the Amal militia leader replies, and he says, it's not that we don't want to, it's that we can't. And then he goes, well, if you don't agree to help us out, we're going to end up having to fight you, and we're going to beat you. And he says, well, you forget one thing, that we the Shiites enjoy suffering. Sort of like a very interesting parable for sort of the total, different wavelengths that both sides are on. In any event, Israel sort of overstays the extremely limited, that's almost an exaggeration in itself, welcome that they had in Lebanon. And amidst this sort of the chaos of the civil war, Hezbollah sort of comes into existence as this very initially sort of motley crew of Shiite militiamen who come from the various groups. And of course, there's lots of Iranian support at the time. The Revolutionary Guard are sent very early on in 82 to Lebanon to help train, help Hezbollah as this sort of exporting the revolution. This is sort of why, the long-standing proxy relationship between Iran and Hezbollah really gets its origins right here. Of course, there's the theological influence from the supreme leader as a source of emulation and all that. But sort of on a military level, it really starts. It starts here. This is, of course, why we see Iran continues to sort of export the revolution in their words by supporting Shiite militias in Bahrain and Iraq and the Houthis, etc. So the first phase that you want to look at Hezbollah and their nascent stage, really fighting very very simple and pretty ineffective tactics. And they almost look at they drew the wrong lessons from the Iranians regarding the Iran-Iraq war, where when I interviewed some of the Israeli soldiers or generals at the time who were on the ground in the 80s, they said Hezbollah was sort of storming our hilltop fortifications and running across minefields, sort of emulating how the Iranians and the Iraqis fought each other. This really, really, damaging conventional war with two conventional armies. And obviously that's not an effective way to do things. And the soldiers recounted, they didn't even know that we had night vision goggles. We would shoot them down in the middle of the night. They'd have no idea where the shots were coming from. And this, of course, eventually triggers an adaptation in Hezbollah. They sort of realize we need to stop doing that. It's not working. We're losing lots of fighters. Now, this is also the phase where Hezbollah is carrying out suicide bombings. If you remember the 1982 Marine Corps barracks bombing, killed 241 U.S. Marines. It was a truck bomb, suicide bomb. Also another attack the same hour against the French paratrooper barracks, killed 58. This is also sort of the kidnapping and hostage taking is rampant at the time. Even the kidnapping of journalists, Western diplomats, Western academics, and even the Archbishop of Canterbury sent his aide or his envoy Terry Waite to Lebanon to sort of try and negotiate the release, and he gets kidnapped himself. And eventually Hezbollah, I think, makes the organizational decision that in order to moderate, they're going to lay off the kidnapping, which eventually subsides in the early 90s, and move away from suicide bombing, at least in a way that is you can attribute it to them. Now, of course, armies only adapt when the threat rises to the level they say, well, we have to change the way we're doing things. So the Israeli army in 1982, keep in mind this is only 9 years since the 1973 Arab-Israeli Yom Kippur War, which is in a way the epitome of a conventional war with a big armored corps, the tank battles on the Golan Heights between Israel and Syria, the dogfights over the Sinai between Egypt and Israel. So that's the kind of mindset that the Israeli army had in 1982-83, really how to fight high-intensity conflict, conventional warfare. And of course, the threat from Hezbollah, they sort of viewed them as the same level as these Palestinian guerrilla groups, militia groups. We could handle them. We don't have to train for them. We don't have to think about it. We know how to deal with it. But of course, that mindset is what gets them into trouble as Hezbollah evolves. Sort of the second phase of Hezbollah's development, if you like, is sort of 1991, 1992, where there's a new Secretary General, sort of takes command, a guy very plugged in with Iran, had been trained up by the Revolutionary Guard, was also trained religiously in Iran, and he sort of changes Hezbollah's organizational security. He realizes that we need to sort of have a core fighting component that's going to be the most synced in and tied in with Iran. We're going to stop charging up hilltops. We're going to operate more at night. And they make sorts of changes like that. They also improve, thanks to the Iranian assistance, with their IED capability. Their explosives get better. And from a techno-tactical level, the sort of cat and mouse game between IED and bomb disposal between Hezbollah and Israel is very, very interesting about the different types of bombs and how to adjust the armor and back and forth. The same sort of story that I think everybody saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. But it's a very interesting case study in the 90s regarding using the Iranian prototypes and stuff like that. So what's interesting in the 90s, that as Hezbollah gets better, Israel says, we don't like this new Secretary General. He's causing us a lot of pain. So what they do is they kill him in 1992. His name was Abbas Musawi, and he's killed in February 92. It's actually, from a military technology perspective, it's one of the first times, they use an Apache helicopter. One of the first times that Israel used the sort of, optical tracking, fine fixed kill chain to sort of do a targeted killing against a militia leader in Lebanon. Sort of a big eye-opener for the group. When you really go back and pore over their speeches and statements at the time, they're very taken aback at the use of this escalation, and also it's an eye-opener for sort of the use of that technology. And they respond with massive Katyusha rocket fire. Now, of course, the Katyushas we know now are the preferred sort of weapon of all the militant groups that border Israel, in Hamas in Gaza or Hezbollah in Lebanon, because they could easily, it's a Soviet rocket, been in use since I think the Second World War, and in use in the Middle East since sort of the 60s. But it's a great way to sort of ride in to target the civilian population. Of course, there was no short-term missile defense system at the time. This is in the 90s. And this is sort of the first time we see that equation and sort of that unspoken dialogue between Israel and Hezbollah, where you do X, if you escalate with us, you're going to get a boatload of rockets it's the wrong analogy, but a ton of rockets into northern Israel, into your population centers. And this is sort of, I could talk about it more in the Q&A, the beginning of this deterrence relationship and this unspoken tacit relationship between both sides that evolves and continues to evolve regarding sort of accepted what actions will elicit what response and sort of tacitly accepted parameters of the conflict. But I'll touch on that in a little bit. The 90s is also important because it's the first time Israel, if you remember, this is the Oslo Accords, the big push from the United States, the Arab-Israeli peace negotiations. So Israel is actually negotiating with Syria at the time, but they're also fighting Hezbollah, which is sort of Syria is the patron of Hezbollah. Syria is funding Hezbollah and arming them and equipping them with Iran, while Israel negotiates with Syria. So they're forced, in a sense, to operate with one hand tied behind their back, sort of fight Hezbollah, but don't escalate too much because you might jeopardize the peace negotiations. I think it's sort of it happens a lot where militaries are forced to sort of translate elusive strategic goals while also, and political constraints, and the guys on the ground are saying we have a job to do, but we're constrained by it, by the political masters. So what's interesting is as Hezbollah improves in the 90s, Israel finally, there's a particularly, a little uptick. They decide that they're going to escalate with there's two large-scale air operations that are notable in the 90s. One in 1993, one in 1996. And despite having troops on the ground sort of trying to, maintain this buffer zone, this security zone between Lebanon and Israel, they use heavy-duty air power. And what's notable is that this is sort of the first indication of the growing reliance from Israel on sort of air power technology. I mean, of course, air power in Israeli military history, we know 67, 73, etc. But this, using all this new technology that they sort of had developed in the years prior. Now, sort of if you pause this story, this is sort of a good place to discuss one of the sort of innovative processes that Israel was sort of toying with, which was very much influenced by what in America they called the revolution in military affairs, which also affected Western militaries all across Europe, and basically anybody who looked to the United States for sort of lessons or like the right way to do things. This was an internal Israeli process that was very much influenced by the U.S. later on. One of the lessons that the Israelis drew from 73 was that they need more technology, more hardware. They were overwhelmed by the conventional Arab armies in 73, so they started investing big time in technology, hardware, and they sort of, in the opening phases of 82, when there was actually a short conventional phase when they had to deal with the Syrians, they're like, oh wow, this technology works great. They downed something like 80 Syrian MiGs and knocked out Syrian air defense, which was all Soviet at the time, in a few minutes. They're saying this technology works for us. Then, of course, 1991 happens, the Gulf War, and everybody watches the U.S. dominate and eviscerate Saddam's army in a few minutes. Of course, no one at the time maybe stopped to look at Saddam's military ineptitude and the fact that he was using tanks in the desert when everyone else was up in the air. But people looked to the U.S. and the 91 experience validating the use of this technology, and this validation leads the Israelis in a sense to be like, look, the Americans also are toying with this technology in 91, the same stuff that we were using in 82, 83 regarding precision technology and standoff firepower, and they go all in a sense, from 91 onwards. This is also influenced, in a sense, and matches up with Israeli domestic constraints, with a particular sensitivity to casualties, which I think in Western militaries, everybody sort of starts to impact everybody, sort of post-heroism, if you like that term, or just nobody wants to lose soldiers, and casualty aversion and an increasing, want to avoid these messy, brutal ground wars. And the Israelis were no different. They sort of buy in big time. There wasn't a particular general that sort of led this innovative charge, but it was very much from the top down. The chiefs of staff at the time buy in big time. There's talk in Israel of establishing a slimmer and smarter army. It's sort of this program that they try and roll out, heavy duty investment on the Air Force. And what is important for our purposes, and which explains the poor performance a decade later, is that it's slowly sort of there's resource competition between the ground forces and the Air Force, and leads to sort of inter-service competition and rivalry between the ground and the air. There's also training cuts, budgetary cuts to the ground forces and to the tank commanders at the expense of standoff firepower, fighter pilots, expensive technological systems. That really leads to that, contributes in a large extent, that inadequate performance that comes 10 years later in 2006. But this is that first indication. You see these two big air operations in 93, 96, sort of first signals of that. And of course, there's that emulation of the U.S. experience and prestige for the Air Force. And it also opened doors, which I think is important if you want to talk about the process. It opened doors to the U.S., to the Department of Defense, to the Office of Net Assessment, and Andy Marshall, and that whole revolution going on in the United States, which was sort of, this kind of funny. The Office of Net Assessment within the Pentagon was sort of leading the charge in the U.S. at the time for this technological revolution, this revolution in military affairs. So it worked for a lot of reasons. It opens doors to the U.S., domestic. They had the existing technology. They used it in '82, and it was validated in the Gulf War. And it sort of goes full steam from this point onwards. There's also a second sort of innovative process that they try and kick off here. And this is actually, it's quite obscure, but I think it's very interesting and took a lot of heat in 2006, which is why I think it's important to talk about, was the Israelis start experimenting with something called campaign design. And it actually is very much, it could come down to a very sort of maverick-like general who's actually sent from Israel. He does his PhD at King's College in the War Studies Department. I'm probably the only person in the world to take out his PhD from the library. It's torture to read, but it was, you have to blow the dust off to get it. And he's also sent, I don't remember if it's to Sandhurst or to Shrivenham, to study here in the UK at one of the defense academies. And he comes from this budding, intellectually minded group of soldiers that are sort of riding this revolutionary technology wave. But they sort of say, with this increased complexity, increased technology, we sort of need, he dives right into operational art. It's like his big thing. And he actually studies with Brigadier Richard Simkin, who I think was at Shrivenham or Sandhurst, who's a big Soviet operational theory guy. And this Israeli general, his name is Shimon Avei. He writes a lot on the Soviets and the 1920s. The General Tukhachevsky becomes like his role model, very obscure Soviet history, which is not my area at all, but he sort of comes up with this theory for campaign design, for operational art, how to make sense of sort of complex battlefield problems. And in a sense, he develops this methodology for campaign design, which was meant to be a methodology to be used to sort of continuously adapt your campaign, your rationale. And as a maverick, he sort of highlights, he gets the stamp of approval from the top staff. He described it when I interviewed him. He sort of describes it as his own intellectual insurgency within the Israeli military. He gets approval from the top brass. He highlights sort of rising stars within in the mid-level officer corps, guys who are not going anywhere, guys who are not retiring, to sort of push through that innovation. And if you just want to talk from an organizational perspective, it was smart. He highlighted these rising stars, who many of them are actually the current chief of staff in Israel right now, was one of his sort of disciples, which is why I often wonder if we're going to see a sort of, I'm jumping ahead, if we're going to see a sort of revitalization at some point of some of the ideas that this guy as a young soldier had with his experiences here. So I think he chose rightly, he identified the rising stars correctly in many respects. Gets secures the support of the top. highlights the early adopters, also buying into this highly complex sort of methodology for campaign design brought prestige, brought promotions, all the things you need to sort of effectively push through an innovation. In a sense, though, the diffusion was incomplete. It was never codified, it was never written down, and this led to a lot of problems in 2006. So if you unpause where we left off, this is all happening in the background, but meanwhile you have guys still bogged down in the mud in Lebanon. None of this stuff is relevant to them. They're fighting tooth and nail in this miserable counter-guerrilla warfare, and there's a general who takes over the command in sort of the northern arena, which covers Lebanon. And in a sense, this is another interesting milestone because he, again, not exactly the right analogy, is the General Petraeus of the IDF, and the fact that he shifts the Israeli military focus in Lebanon. He says we have to stop treating Hezbollah like we treated the Palestinian militias as a terrorist group, as this guerrilla group that we don't have to worry about. We need to fight. We need to learn counter-guerrilla warfare, and we also need to treat them as a guerrilla army, is what he calls them. And it sort of leads to a big conceptual shift, and it's one of two big sort of pushes towards low-intensity conflict guerrilla warfare. But the problem is, and I'll get into that in just a minute, they push too hard to one side. But throughout the 90s, in a sense, because of the open, Israeli military culture is quite informal and very open. It's very different than maybe U.S. or U.K. Sort of organizational culture. Everybody sort of has nicknames for their senior officers, and all their uniforms are open. Everyone knows nobody's tucked in. All that, and there's also a receptivity and an openness to lower level. To soldiers further down the ranks. So this guy who gets sent in the mid 90s as the new head of Northern Command hears about the grumblings from the guys on the ground saying we don't have the knowledge, the tools, the operational methods to fight this kind of war against Hezbollah amongst these villages. This leads to this big push. He's also, as head of Northern Command, he has access to the chief of staff. He gets the sign of approval, and a way that this sort of conceptual change is pushed through. It's sort of an Israeli tried and tested methodology for change, creates a new unit, a commando unit, a special forces unit, and it gives them the sort of time and space to develop counter-guerrilla warfare or tactics, especially for the Lebanon environment. They're empowered to go out there. They don't have to worry about blowback from doing something wrong, and they basically come up with best practices for bush warfare, surveillance, concealment, operating in the Lebanese terrain, which is very hilly, very green and lush like that, and operating in enemy territory for weeks at a time. They perfect all those kinds of things, and then this special forces unit comes back, teaches everybody else the crash course before they get sent to Lebanon. This is what we learn, this is how we do it. And Israel, historically, if you look back, almost always relies on sort of a special forces unit or a chosen commando unit to sort of figure out the best way to do things. And once you figure it out, come back and tell everybody else. Special forces within the Israeli military, like any Western military, they in very high regard, high esteem. But you see this time and time again, as early as the 1950s, and even when Captain Wingate was training the predecessor to the IDF in the British Mandate of Palestine, in a sense, he was the one who sort of ingrained this notion of the offense and the action, and he trains up these core groups of sort of commandos, and that sort of stuck with him all the way through. You want to talk about how culture influences the way to do things. And these special forces units act as incubators, basically, for innovation, for adaptation, and for knowledge development. So they start to make some good gains against Hezbollah in this sort of grueling war. Now, one interesting thing, just in light of Soleimani being in the news, if you in one of the eulogies that the Hezbollah leadership gave after Soleimani was killed, he describes the increasing influence of the IRGC throughout the 1990s, and he says, in 1998, when Soleimani becomes the head of the IRGC Quds Force, he says he comes to Lebanon in 1998. As soon as he assumes command, he starts to help us a lot. He starts to get us the rockets that we need. He starts to teach us how to conceal them. And you do see an increased tempo in operations throughout from 98 onwards. It's not that they were more effective, but the number of attacks goes up, even though Israel had also been making gains with its EGOS unit, with its Special Forces unit. Eventually, the Prime Minister is elected in 1999, Ehud Barak, who is also Defense Minister and has been around a long time, on the platform of getting out of Lebanon. This drip, drip, drip of casualties, about 20, 25 a year, which is not much in the scheme of things, but it hit a particularly raw nerve in Israeli society. There was increasing discontentment. There was large-scale protests. You had one demonstration where 10% of the entire population of the country, came out into the streets to get out of Lebanon. It was a highly unpopular war. It was started under murky pretenses in the early 80s. And the 20 to 25 soldiers a year no one understood what they were doing there anymore. They were bogged down in this security zone, but rockets were flying in no matter what you do on the ground, because the rockets can be fired from the back of a pickup truck or someone's garage. Eventually, they're pulled out. It's a great case study of sort of the impact of domestic populists on a foreign policy decision. It didn't matter necessarily that the army was, in a way, on the uptick, but he pulls everybody out. And this sort of marks the end of this 18-year odyssey in the Lebanon security zone from 1982 to 2000. Now, just a couple of things to keep in mind sort of highlights this period Hezbollah as a versatile learning organization, highlights that patron-client relationship between Syria and Israel, which explains why, Syria and Hezbollah, which explains why Hezbollah is now in Syria, no such thing as a free lunch. Also that relationship between Iran and Hezbollah, Iran being there since the earliest days with all the assistance going forward. And in this eulogy that the Hezbollah leader gave for Soleimani, amazing when he really gives you these little anecdotes about the kinds of help that Soleimani gave him personally over the years. Maybe he took creative license, but the Iranian presence on the ground there is well documented. It also keeps in mind the first time we've seen that sort of back and forth dynamic with the rockets and Israeli action elicits the rocket fire, and there's this, and I didn't really get into it here, but it's in the book, this sort of tacit dialogue, or this dialogue through force between both sides. It's very, and it's ongoing. So in 2000, once they're out, Hezbollah, their goal was to get Israel out of Lebanon, which they succeeded in doing. They come up with a new reason to continue the conflict. There's a small area of disputed territory that's disputed by Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, called the Shebaa Farms. It's like 8 kilometers. It's a tiny little thing. The Israelis say that it's Syrian territory. The Syrians say it's Lebanese. The Lebanese say it's Lebanese. The UN has made up its mind. It's disputed, but this became the new reason that Hezbollah should continue to have its weaponry, which under the accord that was signed by all the warring parties in the Lebanese civil war, they were supposed to give up, but they never did. It's still a point of contention amongst all the other groups in Lebanon to this day. In any event, Hezbollah continues what they're doing, and they do the occasional cross-border incursion. There's actually a couple of successful kidnappings of soldiers crossing into the border and taking them back. Israel withdrew in Lebanon under the pretext that we'll respond to any incursion from Hezbollah, but they don't, because you have to remember in 2000 the Palestinian Intifada kicks off, the second Intifada, which was sort of this uprising that resulted in lots and lots and lots of terrorist attacks and suicide bombings, and the army basically was focusing on that, trying to put a lid on this suicide bombings of buses and restaurants and this kind of thing. So then one summer morning in 2006, Hezbollah does the same thing that they've done over the last couple of years, from 2000 onwards, with these little border incursions. They set off they shoot a anti-tank missile at an armored vehicle, and they kill 3 soldiers, they kidnap 2 more, and they take the Israeli soldiers and bring them back into Lebanon. And this is what starts the 2006 war, which went on for 34 days. And this is where the lessons from the 90s regarding the role of technology and Israel buying big into the revolution in military affairs, as well as the diffusion of this theory for campaign design, which sort of percolated in it. It diffused but unevenly. So what ended up happening was that there were some units that were right up onto, they knew exactly how to effectively design a campaign and how to utilize operational art, but it was not a complete diffusion. It had stayed in sort of these chosen units, incomplete diffusion, when different people are using different command language and things like that, because along with this sort of theory for campaign design was a very complex sort of jargon that introduced sort of a new vocabulary regarding certain terms. I mean, it was all sort of terms that the Soviets had used regarding an operational shock and a swarm and a raid and stuff like that. And it was an incomplete diffusion. And so people blamed this jargon issue as like the reason for the war Israel's poor showing. That's really only a tiny part of the story. The bigger problem was that all this technology and buying in, standoff firepower led to a budgetary diversion away from the ground forces and away from reservists, which was the most important. Reservists were going there with incomplete kit and without having done large-scale, division-size training in years, 3-4 years. All of a sudden, they're called up to go fight Hezbollah. And an important thing to emphasize is that after having been focused on 1973 conventional style warfare throughout the 80s, that shift toward low-intensity conflict, that conceptual shift, really goes up and over by 2000 when the Intifada kicks off, and they're forced to basically do purely counterterrorism operations for 6 years. Almost like policing operations. It's raiding houses and checkpoints and real counterterrorism. The problem is that Hezbollah doesn't fight like that. And if you want to look at the two extremes of high-intensity conventional warfare, 73 style on the one side, and Palestinian low-intensity conflict counterterrorism on the other, Hezbollah basically is bang in the middle. So basically, they had the kit and the technology to fight the Syrians, or have a dogfight over the desert using their fighter jets, or sending in advanced rocketry on one side, but their troops had been doing operationally counterterrorism for the last more than a decade. And of course, Hezbollah fought somewhere in the middle. They basically, while all this is going on, you could ask, what was Hezbollah doing? Basically, they devised, based off the lessons they learned from fighting Israel for 18 years, they devised an operational paradigm perfectly tailored to circumvent Israeli strength, Israeli conventional military superiority. It's not a genius idea. I think all guerrilla groups have done the same, but it was basically a four-pronged approach. They realized, based off their experience in the 90s with these massive Israeli air onslaughts in 93, 96, we need to learn how to absorb precision airstrikes and standoff firepower. So what would they do is they build these bunkers, they conceal them amongst the dense Lebanese vegetation. This was also sort of the predecessor, is a preview to what eventually happened with the tunnels, which we just heard about recently. There was this big operation to get rid of Hezbollah tunnels. The origins of the idea were right here, and I think Israel noticed that, given that they beat Hezbollah to it by getting rid of the tunnels. But they realized that, hey, despite the most sophisticated precision technology, they can't knock out our rockets that are concealed in our bunkers or concealed amongst the bush. So it was absorption, concealment, and what it essentially was an operational approach to survivability. And while this all is going on, they said we have to delay. You're not going to beat an Israeli ground offensive, but we have to delay and harass them through attritional means any Israeli ground approach. And it's the perfect solution to sort of circumvent Israeli conventional military superiority. Everybody, and it's not even necessarily a unique guerrilla paradigm, but it worked perfectly to fight amongst the people, to harass the incoming ground troops while surviving their airstrikes, and you live to fight another day. And it was all designed to prevent that decisive Israeli victory, and it also prevented them a victory narrative that, because of they realized the importance of that rocket arsenal from the 90s, they were able to fire rockets until the very end, to the last day, 34 days of war. The last day was actually, they fired more than they had done in earlier days, really to send the message home. So really prevented the victory narrative. How are we doing on time? So just to sort of highlight, because it's important, the quick chronology of this 34-day war is sort of divided into 3 phases. And on the eve of war, Israel decides we have to respond to this kidnapping. There's a decision, either do we launch a large-scale military campaign or do we go for something more limited? Maybe just from the air. So given the preference for air power, it also, I forgot to mention, the first time ever in Israeli history, the chief of staff was from the Air Force. People like to overplay that a little bit, but having a fighter pilot commanding the army, people always ended up criticizing him for saying he looked at everything through the cockpit. He never really understood the importance of combined arms and jointness and ground operations. A little bit of an overstatement, but some truth. So they decide to go for the second option, a limited operation. So and all that technology and the air power worked great in the opening phase of war. Within the first 34 minutes of war, the Israeli Air Force had basically depleted their target bank. They'd hit hundreds of Hezbollah installations that intelligence had gathered beforehand, every bunker they knew, every command post. And people almost made the argument that they reached their culmination of victory, to use the Clausewitzian term, within 34 minutes. And the war continues on. And on the 5th day should be an indication that maybe you're doing something wrong. Israel decides to outline its war aims. Only comes on the 5th day. The prime minister gets up there and says, we're going to get the soldiers back. We demand a complete ceasefire from Hezbollah. We want the Lebanese army, the national army, to deploy in the south to keep Hezbollah away. And we want the UN to enforce all this. Of course, the UN has been active on the ground there since the 70s and has done very little. The United Nations interim force for Lebanon, interim since 1978. So it's unclear why they thought the UN would be able to get it right in 2006 when they had essentially failed every year since 1978. In any event, that first opening salvo where the Air Force sort of gave the chief of staff a sense of hubris, in a sense, where the politicians didn't really understand the implications of delaying a ground offensive. And because of the sort of what affects all militaries, this sort of casualty aversion, especially within Israel, given sort of the role the army plays in society, there was a delay in calling up these ground troops. And of course, the politicians didn't realize that all those training cuts from the years gone by had deeply affected reservist training who didn't even have the right kit sometimes, and ground forces were just not prepared. Eventually, they move, after about a week and a half, to sort of limited ground operations, and this is actually where that theory for campaign design comes into play. The proponents of that were actually big readers of Wingate. He holds a special place in Israeli military history, and they had part of this jargon with the campaign design. They called for, raids and swarms, and they, in a way, were trying to emulate Wingate and the Chindits in Burma, where you'd make these little go behind enemy lines and hit them through the, pop out before retreating. It was sort of totally inappropriate for the operational environment they were in, and it had only diffused to certain parts of the army. This whole thing about raids and swarms, people threw around it was just a problem with jargon, but it was really much more than that. The concepts behind it were not diffused. You had some generals in Lebanon saying this is the way we got to do a swarm, a multifractal swarm using this new jargon, and others said, I have no idea what you're talking about. And it led to just a lot of confusion regarding these operations in the Lebanese villages. Finally, on day 31 of a 34-day war, there's a large-scale call-up for a ground operation. And of course, you send reservists who have not been trained in a long time after focusing on counterterrorism for the last 6 years into a very different type of operating environment. Hezbollah, we know, somewhere right in the middle. And they make tactical mistakes that have strategic implications and result in losses of life that really were very hard for the Israeli public to swallow regarding some of these botched operations, which is attributed to that intifada-style fighting. Anyway, so this war is sort of a couple of important lessons. It highlights the limitations of technology, which I think the U.S. and the U.K. Sort of learned in 2001 and 2003, where after the opening offensive in Iraq and Afghanistan, immediately, you do the conventional part very easily, and then everything after that becomes hard and messy. The conceptual over-focus on low-intensity conflict and all the problems associated with that, and of course the budget cuts. The role of campaign design in this very sort of complex theory was just basically one part of the problem. You had a pocket of the IDF trying to do something while everybody else wasn't brought up to speed. But really, the problem was much more sprawling, not to mention politicians coming up with war aims after the war is launched on the fifth day, and politicians not talking to the military, and the list goes on. Really systemic failure on many different parts. One thing that's worth noting is sort of Israeli military culture. Sort of the positive is that the informality and the small size led to this technology being diffused relatively rapidly. In just a few years, you sort of had, they had shifted their conceptual focus, their procurement, all that kind of stuff had changed, which is a great for the positive, the rapid diffusion. But the negative is that the sort of proclivity for action and the informality came back to bite them. They didn't codify things and write things down. Never really bothered to develop a conceptual framework that really could harness these dramatic changes they had made in their force size, their force structure, tech acquisition, and stuff like that. Sort of double-edged sword. Of course, you could ask, was Hezbollah so good or was Israel so bad? And I think probably Israel was just that bad. Hezbollah hasn't really adapted the way, they adapted the way they were fighting just to circumvent that tech superiority. So all of a sudden, but 13 years later, is basically more or less quiet between Israel and Hezbollah. So you say, hey, wait a minute, was this war actually a success for Israel? If you want to talk about the long term, it's kept Hezbollah quiet. There's been almost no rocket fire in 13 years. So that's sort of, sometimes it's not so clear immediately what the actual goal was. But of course, in the Middle East, you may be a bit quiet, but no. In Syria and everything that goes along with that kicks off in 2011, 2012. Not so quiet anymore. And we know why the rebels and Assad, the Sunni marginalization in Iraq, the open borders, rise of ISIS, all these factors that we know that lead to sort of Syria to convulse into this mess. Hezbollah enters the fray in 2012 secretly. 2013, they eventually admit it. Of course, Russia follows shortly afterwards. So you guys, why is Hezbollah in Syria? Number one, that allegiance to Iran. That support that Iran gave early on, since 82 onwards, and then in the 90s, all the way through. Of course, Syria being the patron of Hezbollah throughout the 90s. And Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, gives a great speech where he's like, only an idiot wouldn't come and support the government that has cherished the resistance, since the early days. They've had to do a little bit of ideological adaptation. Historically, Hezbollah was set up to fight Israel, to liberate Lebanese territory, and now all of a sudden they're running around in Syria killing Sunni Muslims. So that's been a little bit of a difficult issue for them. They've also lost lots of soldiers lots of fighters while there, upwards of over 1,000, 1,300 by most estimates. And they're starting to grumble domestically in Lebanon, why are we sending our boys to go die in Syria? They've also lost guys with that sort of more senior, seasoned people, including some of their top guys, that means they've lost that tacit expertise, that tacit knowledge by these senior guys being killed. They've lowered the recruitment age. You have 16, 17 baby-faced guys going over there. If you look at the martyrdom posters, some of these guys are gray-haired with real knowledge and expertise fighting the Israelis all the way through. But also some are baby-faced. Their involvement in Syria also eventually led them to get blacklisted and sanctioned and designated by the European Union for their involvement in war crimes against Syrian civilians, and eventually by the UK designating the entire group in its entirety as a terrorist organization, as well as additional sanctions for war crimes and their involvement in terrorism around the globe, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. Of course, what's Israel's response to all this? They basically very simply set up three. You want to talk about that unspoken, that dueling dialogue. They basically, the prime minister goes on TV and says, we have three rules here, three red lines. Number one, no game-changing weaponry from Iran or Syria to Hezbollah, game-changing meaning chemical weaponry, surface-to-air missiles, stuff that's going to tip the balance. Number 2, no Hezbollah or Iranian presence on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights. It's a strategic overlook onto northern Israel. Rockets from there can hit all sorts of key targets. And you've seen every time these red lines are violated, you'll hear about those Israeli airstrikes. So every time there's a weapons depot that blows up outside some military airport in Damascus and a bunch of trucks, that's Israel enforcing that red line. And interestingly, Syria and Hezbollah and Iran are, in a sense, they're aware that they're crossing that red line, and they don't necessarily respond dramatically when that happens. There's been at least 200 airstrikes that Israel's admitted publicly. The chief of staff let it slip in an interview. He said, we've hit them at least 100 times since this all started. And no Iranian presence in the south. So those are sort of the 3 red lines. I think, of course, things get more complicated where Qasem Soleimani gets assassinated by the U.S. in Iraq. Of course, Soleimani on the ground in Syria alongside Hezbollah, alongside the Syrian army and the Revolutionary Guard and the Quds Force guys and all the Afghan and Pakistani Shiite militias. And I'm happy to talk about, I think in the Q&A, talk about maybe some of the implications of Soleimani and some of the things we've learned since his death. But to sort of conclude, what have we just talked about? We talked about the origins of the Israel-Hezbollah conflict, and we discussed sort of the evolution of Hezbollah from its sort of ragtag guerrilla group all the way through evolution of a militant group to where it is today with fancy technology, fighting in Syria. One thing that's just worth mentioning with the Syrian stuff, they've also had, I just can't resist to mention it, they've benefited from some of that Russian military support. One Israeli general said, it's their Russian military education. They, even at some points, Russian air support is supporting a Hezbollah operation. They've been exposed to Russian methods, Russian technology. So that's just another added benefit while I thought of it. But we also discussed, some of the trials and tribulations of Israeli military innovation. First, looking at, they're incorporating all this precision technology and revolutionary technology, toying with this idea of campaign design and operational art, and how it didn't exactly go as planned, though they are trying again. The same characters are sort of back trying to give it another go. We also saw the origins of the entire conflict between Israel and Hezbollah and the various phases and implications. And of course, why and how we've ended up in Syria with everything that we're seeing there. So with that trip around the world, I hope that sort of laid out why this conflict is important and highlights some of the parables and lessons which are relevant for the U.S. and UK, the do's and the to-dos and the not-to-dos. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions about any aspect of the conflict. And thank you again for listening and for having me.